You might have noticed that the title of this sermon is Wrestling. I've done quite a bit of wrestling in my time. Or as we would have said in southern Indiana, wrestling. For I lost my southern Indiana accent. It was not as a sporting event. Usually it was out of anger. Usually it was with my sister, who is closest in age to me. She's 6 years older than me. Her name's Beverly. Because Beverly was 6 years older than me, she was often tasked with the responsibility of babysitting me. And so I had to put up with her as a babysitter. She was tough. I had to toe the line. And then I got big enough to wrestle. And so as I got older and she'd tell me to do something, I'd say, no. At which point in time, she would lay her hands upon myself. She always started it. And we would wrestle. I had one cardinal rule. No matter how good the headlock or the leg lock or the scissors hold, I would never say uncle. I would never, ever give up. No matter how hopeless the hold was she had on me, I would never admit defeat. And then that wonderful day came. That wonderful day when I could take her. And she realized it when it happened. And so our wrestling kind of diminished after that. Although if we did, she would use her guile instead of her brawn. So we would wrestle and I'd throw her down the floor and she'd go, oh, 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 oh. And I'd let go. Then she'd go, put me in a headlock or something. One rule, never say uncle. I'd have wrestled all night before I'd have let go. I don't think I learned the lesson from Jacob, but it's a lesson we can learn from Jacob. I want to again turn to the story of Jacob today and think a little bit about his long night of wrestling. In Genesis chapter 32, we're not going to get there quite yet, but you might want to go ahead and turn there to Genesis 22. You'll find it there. Last time we talked about Jacob last week, we left Jacob out on his way from Beersheba to Haran, going to be with his uncle Laban. But remember, I told you last week that you really don't understand the story of Jacob and his going to his uncle's house, Laban's house. You really don't understand the story of the stairway to heaven unless you understand that Jacob is running for his life. He is fleeing from his brother because his brother has said, basically, I can't do anything about this while my father Isaac is alive, but when Isaac is dead, I will kill my brother. And so, remember, Rebekah hatches this plan for Isaac to go for Jacob to go hundreds of miles away to her brother's house so he can find himself a bride. And so, he finally makes it to Laban's house, and he spends 20 years with his uncle Laban. And during those 20 years, he is dealt with in a less than forthright manner by his uncle, by his family member, Laban. He gets there, and one of the first things he does is he runs into Rachel. And he's gone. He falls in love with her at first sight. And so he goes and begins negotiating her marriage, his marriage to her, with her father Laban. And in those days, it wasn't just, yeah, go ahead. There were certain prices to be paid, and there were certain responsibilities to show that a man could take care of his family. And here came Jacob, destitute with nothing. And so his uncle Laban says, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you want to marry Rachel, you can work for me 7 years, build yourself up some, and then you can marry her. And Jacob is so smitten that no price is too great. So he works for his uncle 7 years. And it seems like just a few days, because he knows he has his eye on the prize. And what's the prize? Rachel. So the 7 years ends. And his wedding day comes. And the morning after his wedding, the light through the tent flaps shows that it's not Rachel in his tent. Now, I've always kind of thought Rachel must have been a beauty and Leah must have been homely. I don't know. I just always had that idea. That may be not true, but it wasn't Rachel. I've always thought this was ironic. Remember I told you last week what Jacob means? Deceiver, liar. What goes around comes around. Because the deceiver gets deceived. It's not right that an older daughter should get married before her younger daughter. So you had to marry Leah. But if you'll work for me simply another 7 years, I'll give you Rachel now. You can marry her and work for me 7 more years. And Jacob is still so smitten that 7 years more is not too much. So he works for his now father-in-law, uncle/father-in-law, for 14 years and gets 2 wives. And they each have a handmaiden, so he gets the handmaidens too. For 14 years. And then after the 14 years are over, he continues to work for his father-in-law. Altogether, 20 years. During the 20 years, if you read the story about when he meets Laban, during the 20 years, he complains that Laban changed his wages 10 times. 10 times. Every time Jacob started getting something good going on and started prospering, Laban would say, well, we can't have this. So he would change the rules for all these years until finally at the very end, Jacob and Laban decide, well, actually they don't decide. Jacob just takes off and Laban comes chasing after him. But finally he leaves the house of Laban because God told him that he should take his family back to Canaan, take his family back to see Isaac. Rebekah is dead. But take his family back to see Isaac. But there's also another problem. Esau. Now think about this. Rebekah is dead. Jacob was Rebekah's favorite. Esau was Isaac's favorite. Rebekah is dead. And Esau, for 20 years, has probably been plotting every way possible to kill his brother. That you could kill people in those days. He had probably imagined doing it hundreds of times. He hated his brother. By rights. I mean, he had deceived him a number of times and stolen his birthright and stole the blessing. No wonder he hated him. And remember, Esau was not only someone who said, I'm going to kill you. Esau was one who could do it. He was the mighty hunter. He was the one who loved to be out in the field. He's the one who loved to camouflage himself and sneak up and follow an animal and get just close enough that he could shoot him with his bow and arrow. You know, there's probably a dozen ways Esau could have killed Jacob, and Jacob wouldn't have even seen him coming. And he goes back to face Esau, to see his father, back home again. You can understand it's with fear and trepidation, great fear, that he approaches the land of Canaan. He crosses over to the area where he knows his brother is now living, and he does something very interesting. Look in Genesis 32, 13 through 15. He gets back to Canaan, and he sends, before he meets Esau, in order to tell Esau he's coming, he sends him some gifts. Verse 13 of Genesis 32. It says, so he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau. Now this is more than a present. 200 female goats and 20 male goats. 200 ewes, female sheep, and 20 rams. 30 milking camels and their calves. 40 cows and 10 bulls. 20 donkeys and 10 male donkeys. And the idea is this. Is Esau going to think that Jacob has come back to claim his inheritance? Because remember, because he now had the birthright, he was entitled to 2/3 of his father's estate. Is he concerned, will Esau be worried that if Jacob comes back, and will he lay claim to 2/3 of his estate? And he's in charge of his whole father's estate at this point in time. Will he want his 2/3 back? And so what Jacob does is very shrewd. Basically what he does is he sends all these offerings, and the point is, I don't need your stuff. I'm wealthy, independently wealthy already. I don't need your stuff. And so he sends this huge gift to his brother Esau, hoping to impress him. And he sends his servants with this message. These are gifts from your servant Jacob. Now that's not, remember when they were still in the womb? We studied this last week. God had told his mother, Rebekah, that the older would serve the younger. And so here, Jacob is coming back, and he is taking the place of the servant. He's saying, these are from your servant, Jacob. He's doing everything he can to make Esau feel comfortable. Esau's response, he puts together an army of 400 men and rides out. Exactly the response that Jacob was afraid of. And so the servants come back and tell Jacob that Esau is on his way with 400 men. And so what does Jacob do? He separates his family. He puts them in safety. And then he crosses the river. And we pick the story up here in chapter 32, verse 24. And it says, and Jacob was left alone. Alone. Kind of reminds you of when he had the dream, right? He was left alone. Perhaps even the same area where there were robbers nearby. He's in danger from wild animals. It doesn't seem like he built a campfire. He's alone. It's dark. Outside, it's pitch black. But inside, it's dark too. And that was troubling Jacob more than the outside darkness. There was a darkness of fear, a darkness of guilt, a darkness of regret weighing down on his soul. He's fearful. He's worried. He's alone. You ever feel that way? When suddenly a hand reaches out and grabs him. It seems to me that if you're in a totally dark place and a hand reaches out and grabs you, you got two choices. The first choice is grab back. My choice would be to run, scram. The hand reaches out, and perhaps Jacob didn't have that choice because the hand reached out and grabbed him. Verse 24, Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. The hand reaches out and the struggle breaks out. Jacob has no idea who his adversary is. For all he knows, really, at this point in time, for all he knows, this could be Esau. He doesn't know who this is. But he does know that this being, this man, it says, is strong. And they wrestle. It seems they wrestle to a stalemate because they wrestle all night long. If you read the book Patriarchs and Prophets, I encourage you to go back and read this chapter if you want a little homework assignment on a Sabbath afternoon when it's going to be rainy, wet outside. If you want to go back to a homework assignment, you can read Patriarchs and Prophets. It's chapter, I'm looking for it, 17, I think. It's called The Night of Wrestling. Yes, chapter 18. The Night of Wrestling. When you read Patriarchs and Prophets, she gives you an insight into what is going on in his mind. Because while he's wrestling, he's having these doubts, he's having these fears, and his guilt is again overwhelming him. As he's wrestling, not a word is said between him and his adversary. But these feelings of doubt and inadequacy and guilt and fear are overwhelming him. And it says they wrestle all night long until the breaking of the day. Now, Jacob has no idea who he's wrestling with, but he does have one cardinal rule. Never give up. Never give up. I mean, he had wanted his brother's birthright for years. And he was always scheming how he was going to get it until he finally got it. Jacob never give up. Finally, as morning draws near, verse 25, when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. At this point in time, you get the idea that the wrestling has been for Jacob's benefit. This person, this being that Jacob is wrestling with, could have gotten out of any hold that Jacob put him in. He could have ended this wrestling much earlier, much sooner. But he touched Jacob's hip. Can you imagine how painful that must have been? How painful. But Jacob still doesn't let go. He still doesn't say uncle. Not after wrestling that long. Verse 26. Then he, the person being wrestled with, said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." I love this. I mean, Jacob now understands that with one touch of a finger, this wrestler can put his hip out of joint. He can break any hold Jacob puts him in. Jacob is not on the ascendancy now. And Jacob has the audacity to hold on to him and say, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Never give up. Never
let go. Because at this point in time, Jacob had realized who he's wrestling with. He tells it, we find this out later on. We'll come back to the story in a second, but we find this out later on in Genesis 32:30. After this is all said and done, it says, so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The word Peniel means the face of God. El at the end is the word for God, Peniel. And Jacob realizes at this point in time, you understand that he knows who he's wrestling with. It's God. As a matter of fact, Patriarchs and Prophets 197 says it was Christ. It was Jesus himself who came down and wrestled with Jacob. And Jacob says, I will not go unless you bless me. And he, Jesus, said to him, Jacob, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he, Jesus, said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Wow, what a change of names. Jacob, liar, deceiver. Changed to Israel, victor. What a change. I imagine that when he gets his name changed, he's really pretty happy about that. It symbolizes the experience of his life, but it also symbolizes the change of his character, the change of the direction of his life. The one who strives with God and prevails. But also it says, strives with God and with man. And so the next day, you remember this part of the story, the next day when he meets Esau, he's expecting to be killed, he gets kissed. What a difference. Because God had spoken to Esau the night before. We talk a lot about dreams that Jacob had, but God gave Laban a dream and told him not to bother Jacob. God gave Esau a dream and said, don't bother Jacob. There are several dreams in this story. But when Jacob and Esau meet the next day, instead of a sword, he gets a hug. And they fall all over each other, and this wonderful reunion. And the 400 guys that are riding with Esau go, really? Is that all there is? They're astounded. Even though Esau had told them about the dream, they're astounded. And so Jacob and Esau are reunited. And we have this lesson. Now, I love this story for various reasons. But in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 201, we have this information. It says, Jacob's experience during that night of wrestling and anguish represents the trial through which the people of God must pass just before Christ's second coming. It says the experience that Jacob went through parallels the experience that the people who are living just before Jesus comes again will also experience. That's interesting. Because if that's true, and if you believe like I do that Jesus' coming cannot be far off, it's very possible that we are the very people that Ellen White's talking about in this passage. We are the very people who need to experience the same trial that Jacob experienced on this night of wrestling and anguish. She says it represents the trial through which the people of God must pass before Christ's second coming. You need to go through and read the rest of this chapter, because she talks about the difficulties and the trials and tribulations that we will face during that period of time, during the time when it speaks about Jacob's time of trouble. She says that we'll experience the same kind of trial. But then she writes later on in the chapter, she writes this. She says, Jacob prevailed
because he was persevering and determined. His experience testifies to the power of importunate prayer. Now, I don't know about you, but I have not used the word importunate for months. I may have never used the word importunate except for when I'm reading from this passage. And so I decided to go back to the dictionary and find out what importunate meant. Now, you get an idea of what it means because in the next sentence it says, "It is now that we are to learn this lesson of prevailing prayer, of unyielding faith." So you get the idea that importunate prayer means prevailing prayer. But if you go back to you get the word importunate. There we go. The meaning of the word is to be persistent. You got that, right? But it's persistent to the point of being annoying. Can God get annoyed by our prayers? I don't think so, but that's human beings would be. And so that's telling us about our prayer life, about how we should wrestle with God, how we should call upon His name. It's interesting that oftentimes dictionaries will use the word in a sentence or use the word in a phrase. So the dictionary says persistent to the point of being annoying, like importunate bill collectors. You owe a credit card bill. You're 6 months over, you're on your credit card bill. They turn you over to a credit agency. And I'm told, never had this happen to me, honestly, I really haven't. I'm told that they'll call almost every day trying to collect that bill. And Ellen White says that's the kind of experience we should have with God. Wrestling with God. Importunate prayer. Prevailing prayer. She said, "It is now that we are to learn this lesson of prevailing prayer, of unyielding faith." And then she says this, the greatest victories of the Church of Christ. Are you interested in victories? The greatest victories of the Church of Christ, or to the individual Christian. Are you interested in personal victories in your life? Are you interested in how the greatest victories can be gained? She says, the greatest victories of the church, or to the Church of Christ, or to the individual Christian, are not those that are gained by talent or education, by wealth, or the favor of men. The things that we look at when we evaluate people, she says those are not the things that will lead to the greatest victories. When a church interviews a pastor, they oftentimes want to know about his education. They would never ask how much a pastor makes or whether he's wealthy. But they want to know his reputation. And so in an interview with a pastor in a church might ask these questions about their education, about their talents, or their wealth, or whether they're liked by other men. You see, we look upon people and we value them by those things. And oftentimes, those kind of talents and those kind of things can make people successful. But she says here, the greatest victories to the Church of Christ and to the individual Christian are not those that are gained by talent or education, by wealth, or by the favor of men. They are those victories, the greatest victories. They are those victories that are gained in the audience chamber with God, when earnest, agonizing faith lays hold upon the mighty arm of power. That's where the great victories are held. Perhaps, if that's true, a church shouldn't, when they're interviewing a pastor, ask about his education. Perhaps they ought to ask him about his prayer life. And maybe that's what I should ask about in your life. How's your prayer life? Are you spending time wrestling with God? Or do you have a prayer with your, as Elder Maury Venden used to say,
a prayer and a verse with your hand on the doorknob as you're going out. I don't know what you are wrestling with right now, but I know that the greatest victories are those that are won in prayer. As you wrestle with God, as you wrestle with Him. I look at you today. I don't know what you're struggling with, what you're wrestling with God about. And you're happy, I don't know. I'm happy you don't know what I'm struggling with. But God knows. But God knows. And I do know that the Bible points out the fact that there are two groups of people when it comes to this struggling with God. Two groups of people in the church today. Two groups of people here right now. You're one of the two groups. The two groups of people are, the first group are those who are indeed striving with God. They are convicted of their self-sufficient condition, and they want God to take away self-sufficiency and meet the needs of their hearts. There's one group of people in the church today who are striving with God, who are listening and wrestling with Him in prayer. The second group of people are those who are not doing that. They're looking at themselves in a mirror and listening to Satan, who says, "You're not that bad. You're okay. Doesn't matter. You know, God's merciful. Don't worry about that little thing you did. Don't worry about that thought. Happy with how you are." Two groups of people. Which one are you in? How does one gain the victory? Well, if you look at the world's way of gaining victory, you know, there's, for every problem you have, there's at least one self-help book that you could read. Right? There's at least one 12-step program for any problem that you're struggling with in your life. And if all else fails, watch Oprah. If Oprah doesn't have the answer, the greatest victories of the church of Christ and to the individual Christian are not those that are gained by talent or education, by wealth or the favor of men, not by self-help groups, not by self-help books. They are those victories that are gained in the audience chamber with God when earnest, agonizing faith lays hold upon the mighty arm of power. Let's sing as we close, number 484. We're going to sing just the first.